Hello, everyone. I'm Chuck Brooks. I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. I've been in government 3 times. The first time I came out of grad school to come work in Washington, figure I'd spend a couple of years here, and I joined the Voice of America. It was a fun time during the Cold War, so it was a real interesting area, and worked with the director, the special assistant to the director, and got my taste of Washington. And here I am over 20 years later. I've never gone back to Chicago, although I might if the Cubs win the World Series. But so anyway, after that, I spent almost 8 years working in Congress on the Hill for the late Senator Arlen Specter, where I worked in national security issues and foreign affairs and technology issues. And my third stint is after I got a call from a good friend if they asked me I wanted to be part of a small startup. I said, well, it depends what it is, and it was Department of Homeland Security. So I was one of the plank holders at the Department of Homeland Security, and I went in there, and my first job was to help set up the legislative shop because they had nothing. They had one building in GSA run by a bunch of mostly Secret Service and Coast Guard people, detailed, and we set up a legislative shop, and then later on I went to work on the Science and Technology Directorate, which is really one of the only parts of the Department of Homeland Security that didn't come from somewhere else. And it's a fun place because all the R&D came out of there. And lately I've been mostly doing a lot of writing for Federal Times, The Hill, Government Security News, other publications. And I'm in the private sector. For the last few years I worked for a company called Rapiscan that make bomb detection equipment. I was head of R&D. And I've also now working in Xerox for a few years before they stopped their federal practice. And now a new company called Sutherland Government Solutions, where I'm helping them set up a federal practice. I love speaking about cybersecurity because when I first went to DHS, it was sort of a second thought. Everything was more concerned with chemical, biological, radioactive, explosives. Cyber was an afterthought. But there was one great comment by the first director of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge, who said that a few lines of code can wreak more havoc than a bomb. And that is certainly true, particularly as we've grown into a more interconnected world. And the second quote really sort of sums up why we're so vulnerable. And it's by the former general counsel of the NSA. And if we could read it here. The internet was not built for security. Yet we have made it into the backbone of virtually all private sector and government operations, as well as communications. Pervasive connectivity has brought dramatic gains in productivity and pleasure, but they created equally dramatic vulnerabilities. Huge heights of personal information are common. Cyber theft of intellectual property and infrastructure penetrations continue at a frightening pace. And that's the challenge of cybersecurity. It wasn't made for that. I call this the threatscape, and as you can see the slide's a little hazy. It's hazy on purpose because the threatscape is always morphing. There's so many different types of threats out there in cybersecurity, and so many different new technologies being brought on board and trying to discover, monitor the web that it's sometimes difficult to get a grasp of what's happening. I'm going to go over these very quickly because I realize now that the audience is a sophisticated audience that has a pretty deep understanding of cyber, so I'd sort of go quickly over some of the threat actors that were just more detailedly elaborated in the prior presentation. Of course, there's the most common one, or what you call the hacker script, or the kiddie hobbyists that work on their computers at night in the basement, have fun hacking, doing stuff, and they can create havoc, as evidenced by last year when one of those types hacked into the CIA director's personal email. And so it's still quite a threat. Everyone is vulnerable, even if you're director of the CIA. Then, of course, the insider threat and disgruntled employees, and that's a huge problem in the private sector because there's really 2 big threats that take away private sector data. One is phishing. As was mentioned, almost everyone will somehow click on a false email saying that you have won $5 million, whatever, go to the site. And people do it. They do it in the government, and they do it in the private sector. The second one is insider threat. There's a lot of disgruntled employees. They have access to administration rights. They have access to networks, and they often leave with IP. The hackavists I mentioned, industrial espionage. This is really almost related to the multinationals. A lot of the major companies have trade secrets. It used to be just Coca-Cola and their magic formula and Kentucky Fried Chicken, but now everything is algorithms. So everyone wants to find out the latest code, find out what they're doing and what the business intelligence is. Foreign espionage and terrorism, which were so well discussed in the last presentation, and of course state-sponsored terrorism. Cyber threats, and this I'm just going to really speed through because I'm sure you all understand basically the components of what make a real cyber threat. And of course the most common one, Trojan virus, which has been around for eternity. And viruses, of course, are programs that replicate themselves. Cybersecurity is much like the human body, subject to attacks and viruses and defenses and immunities. Worms that can spread from one computer to the other. Distributed denial of service attacks, the fear of a lot of government agencies and industries of having their systems taken down by a massive bunch of traffic sent to one site. Zero-day vulnerabilities, in a hole in the software where adversary can get in and basically exploit the system. And then the spyware, which I'm sure that most of you have probably experienced. If you've clicked on an ad, it downloads something, watches your computer. In botnets, which are more used for attacks, Stuxnet, other things like that. And the most common, which I just mentioned, is phishing and spear phishing. And now they call one called whale phishing. So the attackers have decided, or the cyber people that want to get your information, decided that, well, let's go to the leadership of these companies, and they're called the whales. And there's people who are assistants to the directors or the vice presidents, and so they've become more and more recently, particularly in industry that have such attacks. And of course, there's one other area that has sort of taken cybersecurity by storm, and pretty much the most prevalent type of attack recently, called ransomware. Ransomware is very scary. It's when you see something pop up on your computer and say you're done. Give me money, send this, or you're not getting your information back. And that's happening more and more. Critical infrastructure is one of the areas I wanted to talk about, and this really is the private sector owns most of the critical infrastructure in the United States, but the government regulates it and protects it. It's a sort of a joint operation, though it has not been so smooth sailing until recently. There's been much more information sharing that's been implemented, and we're starting to get there. But I'll go quickly on what the critical infrastructure is. Of course, there's the government. And the government is all the .gov, all the agency websites. It's all the facilities for citizen services. And it's also the elections and everything that's dealing with state, local, and federal, and sometimes even international aspects. The military, which really has been for many years way beyond civilian capabilities and capacity in cybersecurity, mainly because of their deep concentration in engineering and technical people, and also because they're very mission-oriented. They're not exposed to a lot of what the civilian agencies are exposed to. The power grid, our power grid was built in the 1970s, most of the generators. So it's not just cyber they're vulnerable to. It could be a solar flare. We don't really have a lot of hardening of our power grid, and a lot of it is very old technology. So that is definitely a vulnerability, and there's been a couple of incidents which I'll get to in a few minutes when I go over that. Telecommunications, of course, the phones, telecom, major target. Transportation, air traffic control, cars, airlines, trains, energy, fuel supplies, pipelines. Banking and finance, probably the most targeted part of the private sector, because that's where the money is. So people want to go there. Identity theft, huge issue there. And emergency services, interoperability of law enforcement, police things. There's been issues there too. So everything it's definitely part of the critical infrastructure. And food and water, which is all vital. And if you were an adversary really wanting to do major hurt on the U.S., that's something you would target, because a lot of those are not well protected. This is interesting to look quickly at some stats. And the number of cyber incidents reported by federal agencies jumped more than 1,300%, from 5,503 to 77,000 over the last 10 years. So obviously there's much more attention being paid to getting into our infrastructures. Ransomware attacks on government agencies around the world have tripled in the past year. I'll go a little bit more detail about ransomware later. About 4% of government agencies have been exposed to NIMAIM and 3% to Lockheed, both of the ransomware viruses. So as I mentioned, ransomware is more and more prevalent. The OPM breach, the heist of over 22 million current and former employees, I was being one of them, our information, sometimes actually the security clearance files were stolen. They were not well protected, not encrypted, and it's supposed that the foreign governments got those. In elections, very contemporary issue. There has been a couple of attacks reported in elections in Kansas, Illinois, mostly a data voter bases. And now that this has happened, DHS and the Pentagon have agreed to coordinate to help protect the election process of 33 states. It's a real difficult thing to really describe because there's over 8,000 different sites for elections and probably almost as many systems of software is being used. Nothing has been done with any protocols or upgraded. So it'd just be very difficult to make a big impact, but you could cause some problems. And there really is only one way to protect from election attack, and that's having paper ballots. Role of government, cybersecurity. I will leave out the military side because that it has its own role, and of course the intelligence community with NSA, FBI, CIA, and others. But in the civilian side, it's primarily Department of Homeland Security, and that's been an evolving role. As I said, in the last 4 years, it's more codified, and legislation has been passed to sort of give the principal role of outreach, which is primarily to the private sector, to the Department of Homeland Security. As I mentioned, that 85% of the private critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. In 2013, that was codified by President Obama to creating that authority to the Department of Homeland Security, so it's relatively new. And then there's also that they made the Department of Homeland Security the lead civilian agency to deal with all the other agencies. So all the .gov issues, all the other small agencies that may have incidents under the guidelines of NPPD, and runs a program for the government and runs a program called Einstein. Interesting enough, the person that was primarily responsible for coordinating that just became the first chief security officer for the government, General Greg Tuhill. I won't go into this. Basically, the basics for any SCADA systems is critical security controls, and I just if you take a SANS course or look into this, the first thing you go into. Cybersecurity at DHS, as I mentioned, they're responsible for the .gov domain. They're also run an organization called USCERT, which alerts the private sector and governments of what's out there. What are the threats, the current threats, and that has been really a key element of information sharing. Because if you don't know what's out there and know what's happening, you can't sort of mitigate it. It's dangerous. Now I'll get specifically into the critical infrastructures and what's happened recently in terms of cyber. As I mentioned this already before, protecting the grid, utilities, solar energy, data centers, water, all part of our energy system. And a lot has happened. Actually, yesterday there was an interesting announcement by the head of the International Atomic Energy Commission who said, yes, there was a cyber attack on a nuclear plant. So it's been admitted. They didn't admit where, but it's happened. So definitely there's a vulnerability to nuclear plants around the world as other plants. There was a nice quote by Admiral Mike Rogers, who is the head of the National Security Agency and the U.S. Cyber Command, just basically said that China and two other countries actually have the ability to launch a cyber attack that could shut down the entire U.S. power grid and other critical infrastructure. Unlikely to happen because we can do the same, but the real risk is other countries like North Korea and maybe rogue elements getting that capability that sometimes now some of the major countries have now. In the United States, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Cybersecurity Emergency Response Team responded to 295 cyber incidents in the energy sector last year. and that's a huge amount of cyber incidents. So it's not a lot of hacktivists doing this. These are it's a combination of environmental organizations that want to send a message, and also a lot of potentially foreign elements testing our vulnerabilities, and also disgruntled employees, or at least a couple of them. Frequency and sophistication and cost of data breaches are increasing, according to the World Energy Council. And they acknowledged and spoke about the first actual successful attack on a power plant, and that was Russia of Ukraine, which happened last year. In South Korea last year, the hackers targeted, the North Korean hackers targeted the Korea's hydro and nuclear power company, and caused some malfunctions. And there was an attack on a nuclear plant. An attack on a nuclear plant, as was discussed yesterday, could cause some meltdown theoretically. Although I got to say that most of the nuclear plants run SCADA systems that are hardened for cyber, but everything again is vulnerable. It depends upon how determined your adversary is. Finance, commerce, pretty much everything in retail and everything in banking. Lots of things happening there. There was a hacking scheme. The Bangladesh Central Bank just happened this year, where they stole $81 million, and it caused an alarm because they did it with SWIFTs. And so the whole banking system is now examining how to prevent such an occurrence from happening again. In 2016, earlier this year, the Justice Department indicated 7 hackers from the Iranian regime tried to stage a coordinated cyber attack that targeted 46 major financial institutions in a dam outside New York City. That didn't get a lot of attention, but it got a lot of attention internally, particularly by the Department of Homeland Security. And so that shows that a foreign actor has a capacity to send a message to our banking system. Federal Bureau of Investigation, which there are several of them here, estimated there were more than 500 million financial records hacked in 2013. I don't have the most recent statistics, but there's more than that now. If you look what's just happened recently, just with Yahoo having 500 million accounts taken, every day there's more and more people are online, more and more hacks, and a lot of it's going to the dark web and sold. And according to the Ponemon Institute, over 43% of companies had breaches last year, including Home Depot, Target, and others. And I think that number is way too low. As it was mentioned earlier, companies don't want to let the public know that they've been hacked for their stock prices or their competitors. So most of this is internal, but when it gets so big, such as a situation like Target or Sony, there's no way to hide it. And according to CSIS, cybercrime now costs the global economy about $445 billion every year, which is a huge amount. Other area of real concern, protecting the private sector, of course, is health and medicine, as everyone uses it. Okay. Going to some of the recent things that happened. I mentioned ransomware has become a weapon of choice by cyber security hackers, and there were a couple hospitals that were actually hacked. And one of them was the Hollywood Presbyterian Memorial Hospital, and they ended up paying $17,000 ransom, which is not much considering, to get their network systems back. And this is significant because hospitals are, by their design, a lot of different types of devices and components and different networks, nursing stations, wireless. So they're easy. They're easy to attack to. And so if you're in the health industry, or if you're running a hospital, you're more likely to pay because you don't want to have the liability of put a patient at risk. And so if I say that there's one vertical of critical infrastructure that needs a lot more attention, it's the health industry, particularly as we go to remote medicine and telemedicine. The vulnerabilities are evident. And Boston Children's Hospital was also a target of a distributed denial attack that wasn't as successful, but there's more and more of those happening. And the interesting thing is that on the black market, healthcare records are a premium. They're twice as much as a personal financial record. So there's a lot of incentive for the bad guys to go after healthcare. Transportation, I'll just get into that really quickly because it's time sensitive. We're moving to connected cars, and it's already been demonstrated a couple times that by researchers out of the University of Virginia and others that you can hack connected cars, and they're trying to do that now, build a defense to that, which is difficult because you have a lot of manufacturers and a lot of competing interests, and there's no standard uniform code now yet for how to defend against that. And also, if you look at transportation, you have to look at aviation. And last year, a Polish airline had its flight operations system hacked, resulting in a cancellation of 22 flights. And then there was an American security company that claims to have hijacked a flight critical controls by using the entertainment system on the plane. So everything is vulnerable. It's connected. Securing the digital future very quickly. We're moving into, and I think I'll end it quickly here, is that we're moving into the Internet of Things. And so it's going to be hyperconnectivity. It's really going to be everything that touches our lives, from everything in our house, our communications, our banking, everything you can deal with in critical infrastructure. And Cisco estimated by 2020 there'll be 50 billion devices that are interconnected. So if you look at that, we're rushing to find some sort of way to protect the Internet of Things, which is going to really be almost insurmountable because there is no protocols. Just like I mentioned with the auto industry, there's tens of thousands of different manufacturers. There's the universal underwriters codes on some things, but not on cyber code. So it is until that there's sort of a global consortium that can have at least standards and enforcement of the Internet of Things, it's going to be a very rocky road for a lot of us, and easy pickings for cyber attackers. And I'll end it here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you to the three speakers. Just let me make a quick segue into a connection between those three presentations. What is interesting is starting with John Perrin, we were like kind of clearly seeing the progression of terrorism, the interest that the U.S. had for terrorism from domestic to more international, but also the degree of sophistication that comes out from the operations of organization, and also like being able to be directed from overseas and so on and so forth, but directed from overseas through very often internet channels, like through propaganda, on websites, or sent through social media and so on and so forth. What is interesting also is what they're capable of doing is using kind of internet as a vehicle to send out their propaganda, but also to start to commit some attacks. Also, like they defaced, for example, some of the website of local news channel, you remember, like I Love ISIS kind of on the website and so on and so on. So they were able to do that. It was not major, but it was showing like some of the capacity that they have. And I was like trying to make a kind of parallel. It's not a perfect one, but it's a little bit like they were using for a long time, they being the terrorists, airplanes as the symbol of not just travel and people trapped in a plane and so on, and making like mass murder in the same time, but also it's a symbol of globalization, right? That's why they focus so much on plane, international travel and so on, because it's the symbol of propagating Western's values, Western's imperialistic interests and so on and so forth. And it's interesting that they're still going through this globalization, but now they are using more and more another vehicle than planes, and that's called internet. And that's an interesting as a alternative route that they are taking, because if you look at what Al-Qaeda was doing before, they were not that savvy in doing videos. It was like very amateurish and so on and so forth. And then ISIS kind of changed that game totally in terms of using internet and using social media. So that's an interesting thing. And that segue into also like what they were be able to do. Like if you remember when allegedly the US and the Israeli unleashed Stuxnet, it kind of revealed the world what you can do with, like those kinds of cyber weapons. But it also kind of revealed to everybody what could be done. And not only states could do the same thing in return, like it could be interesting to establish yes or no if Aramco is a response to the Stuxnet attack, because it was loosely coupled, attributed to Iran. So that's interesting. But it could be also interesting to see if a non-state actor can use the same kind of weapon to do the same kind of things on critical infrastructure, something like more vulnerable that they can like masterize and use against us by using what we kind of display in terms of cyber weapons. Like start learning how to develop a cyber arsenal like we developed one, as long as we are using them publicly and in the public domain like we did with Iran.